The Life of Abraham Lincoln by Henry Ketchum. To my two older brothers, John Lewis Ketchum and William Alexander Ketchum, who under Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief loyally served their country in the war for perpetuation of the Union and the destruction of slavery, this book is affectionately dedicated. The question will naturally be raised, why should there be another life of Abraham Lincoln? This may be met by a counter-question. Will there ever be a time in the near future when there will not be another life of Lincoln? There is always a new class of students and a new enrollment of citizens. Every year, many thousands of young people pass from the grammar to the high school grade of our public school. Other thousands are growing up into manhood and womanhood. These are of a different constituency from their fathers and grandfathers who remember the Civil War and perhaps were in it. To the younger generation, writes Coral Scroats, Abraham Lincoln has already become a half-mythical figure which, in the haze of historic distance, grows to more heroic proportion, but also loses in distinctness of outline and figure. The last clause of this remark is painfully true. To the majority of people now living, his outline and figure are dim and vague. There are today professors and presidents of colleges, legislators of prominence, lawyers and judges, literary men and successful businessmen, to whom Lincoln is a tradition. It cannot be expected that a person born after the year, say, 1855, could remember Lincoln more than as a name. Such an one's ideas are made up not from his remembrance and appreciation of events as they occurred, but from what he has read and heard about them in subsequent years. The great mine of information concerning the facts of Lincoln's life is, and probably will always be, the history by his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay. This is worthily supplemented by the splendid volumes of Miss Tarbell. These are other biographies of great value. Special mention should be made of the essay by Coral Scroats, which is a classic. The author has consulted freely all the books on the subject he could lay his hands on. In this volume there is no attempt to write a history of the times in which Lincoln lived and worked, as have been narrated were selected solely because they illustrated some phase of the character of Lincoln. In this biography the single purpose has been to present the living man with such distinctness of outline that the reader may have a sort of feeling being acquainted with him. Chapter 1. The Wild West. At the beginning of the 20th century there is, strictly speaking, no frontier to the United States. At the beginning of the 19th century, the larger part of the country was frontier. In any portion of the country today, in the remotest villages and hamlets, on the enormous farms of the Dakotas or the vast ranches of California, one is certain to find some, if not many, of the modern appliances of civilization, such as were not dreamed of 100 years ago. Aladdin himself could not have commanded the glowing terms to write the prospective of the closing years of the 19th century. So, too, it requires an extraordinary effort of the imagination to conceive of the condition of things in the opening years of that century. The first quarter of the century closed with the year 1825. At that date Lincoln was nearly 17 years old. The deepest impressions of life are apt to be received very early, and it is certain that the influence which are felt previous to 17 years of age have much to do with the formation of the character. If then we go back to the period named, we can tell with sufficient accuracy what were the circumstances of Lincoln's early life. Though we cannot precisely tell what he had, we can confidently name many things which in this day we class as the necessities of life which we had to do without, for the simple reason that they had not yet been invented or discovered. In the first place, we must bear in mind that he lived in the woods. The West of that day was not wild in the sense of being wicked, criminal, ruffian. Morally and possibly intellectually, the people of that region would compare with the rest of the country of that day or this day. There was little schooling and no literary training, but the woodsman had an education of his own. The region was wild in the sense that it was almost uninhabited and untilled. The forests, extending from the mountains in the east to the prairies in the west, were almost unbroken and were the abode of wild birds and wild beasts. Bears, deer, wild cats, raccoons, wild turkeys, wild pigeons, wild ducks, and similar creatures abounded on every hand. Consider now the separateness of the population. Kentucky has an area of 40,000 square miles. 1 year after Lincoln's birth, the total population, white and colored, was 406,511, or an average of 10 persons, say less than 2 families, to the square mile. Indiana has an area of 36,350 square miles. In 1810, its total population was 24,520, or an average of 1 person to 1.5 square miles. In 1820, it contained 174,173 inhabitants, or about 4 to the square mile. In 1825, the population was about 245,000, or less than 7 to the square mile. In the capital city of Indianapolis, which is today of surpassing beauty, was not built nor thought of when the boy Lincoln moved into the state. Illinois, with its more than 56,000 square miles of territory, harbored in 1810 only 12,282 people. In 1820, only 55,211, or less than 1 to the square mile, while in 1825 its population had grown to a trifle over 100,000, or less than 2 to the square mile. It will thus be seen that up to his youth Lincoln dwelt only in the wildest of the wild woods, where the animals from the chipmunk to the beaver were much more numerous and probably more at home than man. There were few roads of any kind, and certainly none that could be called good, for the mud of Indiana and Illinois is very deep and very tenacious. There were good saddle horses, a sufficient number of oxen, and carts that were crude and awkward. No locomotives, no bicycles, no automobiles. The first railway in Indiana was conducted in 1847, and it was, to say the least, a very primitive affair. To the carriages there may have been some, but a good carriage would only be a waste on those roads in that forest. The only pen was the goose quill, and the ink was homemade. Paper was scarce, expensive, and, while of good material, poorly made. Newspapers were unknown in that virgin forest, and books were like angels' visits, few and far between. There were scythes and sickles, but of a grade that would be saleable today at any price. There were no self-binding harvesters, no mowing machines. There were no sewing or knitting machines, though there were needles of both kinds. In the woods thorns were used for pins, guns were flintlocks, tinder boxes were used until the manufacture of the friction match. Artificial light came chiefly from the open fireplace, though the tallow dip was known, and that there were some housewives who had time to make them and the disposition to use them. Illumination by means of molded candles, oil, gas, electricity came later. That was long before the days of the telegraph. In that locality there were no mills for weaving cotton, linen, or woolen fabrics. All spinning was done by means of the hand loom, and the common fabric of the region was linsey woolsey, made of linen and woolen mixed, and usually not dyed. Antiseptics were unknown, and a severe surgical operation was practically certain death to the patient. Nor was there either chloroform or cocaine for the relief of pain. As to food, wild game was abundant. but the kitchen garden was not developed and there were no importations. No oranges, lemons, bananas, no canned goods. Crusts of rye bread, browned, ground, and boiled. This was coffee. Herbs of the wood were dried and steeped. This was tea. The root of the saffrus furnished a kind of tea, a substitute for the India and Ceylon teas now popular. Slippery elm bark soaked in cold water sufficed for lemonade. The milk house, when there was one, was built over a spring when that was possible, and the milk vessels was carefully covered to keep the snakes out and other creatures that like milk. Whiskey was almost universally used. In spite of the constitutional 16-1, it was locally used as the standard of value. The luxury of quinine, which came to be in general use throughout the entire region, was of later date. These details are few and meagre. It is not easy for us, in the midst of the luxuries, comforts, and necessities of later civilization, to realize the conditions of Western life previous to 1825. But the situation must be understood if one is to know the life of the boy Lincoln. Imagine this boy. Begin at the top and look down him, a long look, for he was tall and gaunt. His cap in winter was of coon skin, and the tail of the animal hanging down behind. In summer he wore a misshapen straw hat with no hatband. His shirt was of linsey woolsey, above described, and was of no colour whatever, unless you call it the colour of dirt. His breeches were of deerskin, and the hair outside. In dry weather these were what you please. But when the wet they hugged the skin with the clammy embrace, and the victim might sigh in vain for sanitary underwear. These breeches were held up by one suspender. The hunting shirt was likewise of deerskin. The stockings, there weren't any stockings. The shoes were cowhide, and the moccasins made by his mother were substituted in dry weather. There was usually a space of several inches between the breeches and the shoes, exposing a tanned and bluish skin. For about half a year he went barefoot. There were schools, primitive and inadequate indeed, as we shall presently see, but the little red schoolhouse on the hill, with the stars and stripes floating proudly above it, was not of that day. There were itinerant preachers who went from the one locality to another, holding revival meetings. But church buildings were rare, and to say the least, not of artistic design. There were no regular means of travel, and even the star route on the post office department was slow in reaching those secluded communities. In such circumstances and conditions, Lincoln was born and grew into manhood. Chapter 2. The Lincoln Family. When one becomes interested in a boy, one is almost certain to ask, whose son is he? And when we study the character of a great man, it is natural and bright that we should be interested in his family. Where did he come from? Who were his parents? Where did they come from? These questions will engage our attention in this chapter. But it is well to be on our guard at the outset against fascinations on any theory of heredity. Every thoughtful observer knows something of the seductions of this subject either from experience or from observation. In every subject of research there is danger of claiming too much in order to magnify the theory. This is emphatically true of this theory. Its devotees note the hits but not the misses. It took 5 generations of cultured clergymen to produce an immersion. Undoubtedly, but what of the 6th and 7th generations? Darwin's greatness came from his father and grandfather. Very true, but are there no more Darwins? If Abraham Lincoln got his remarkable character from parents or grandparents, from whom did he get his physical stature? His father was a little above medium height, being 5 feet 10.5 inches. His mother was a little less than medium height, being 5 feet 5 inches. Their son was a giant, being no less than 6 feet 4 inches. It is not safe to account too closely for his physical, mental, of moral greatness by his descent. The fact is that there are too many unexplored remainders in the factors of heredity to make it possible to apply the laws definitely. The writer will therefore give a brief account of the Lincoln family simply as a matter of interest, and not as a means of providing or explaining any natural law. The future president was descended from people of the middle class. There was nothing either in his family or in his surroundings to attract the attention even of the closest observer, or to indicate any material difference between him and scores of other boys in the same general locality. Lincoln is an Old English name, and in 1683 a family of the name settled in Hingham, Mass, near Boston. Many years later we find the ancestors of the president living in Berks country. It is possible that this family came direct from England, but it is possible that they came from Hingham. Both in Hingham and in Berks country there is a frequent recurrence of certain scriptural names, such as Abraham, Mordecai, and Thomas, which seems to be more than a coincidence. From Berks country certain of the family who by the way were Quakers, moved to Rockingham County. In 1769, Daniel Boone, the adventurous pioneer, opened up what is now the state of Kentucky, but was then a part of Virginia. About 12 years later, in 1781, Abraham Lincoln, great-grandfather of the president, immigrated from Virginia into Kentucky. People have asked in a puzzled manner, why did he leave such beautiful Shenandoah Valley? One answer may be given. The Ohio Valley is also beautiful. During the major portion of the year, from the budding of the leaves in April until they pass away in the blaze of their autumn glory, the entire region is simply bewitching. No hills curve more gracefully, no atmospheres more soft, no watercourses are more enticing. Into this region came the Virginian family, consisting, besides the parents, of 3 sons and 2 daughters. A year or 2 later, the head of the family was murdered by a skulking Indian, who proceeded to kidnap the youngest son, Thomas. The oldest son, Mordecai, quickly obtained a gun and killed the Indian, thus avenging his father and rescuing his little brother. This boy, Thomas, was father of the president. He had been called by some writers shiftless and densely ignorant, but he seemed to have been more a creature of circumstances. There was no schools, as he consequently did not go to school. There was no steady employment, and consequently he had no steady employment. It is difficult to see how he could have done better. He could shoot and keep his family supplied with wild game. He did odd jobs as opportunity opened, and just growed. But he had force enough to learn to read and write after his marriage. He had the roving disposition which is, and always has been, a trait of pioneers. But this must be interpreted by the fact that he was optimistic rather than pessimistic. He removed to Indiana because to him, Indiana was the most glorious place in the whole world. He later removed Illinois because that was more glorious yet. He certainly showed good taste in his selection of his wives, and what is equally to the purpose, was able to persuade them to share his humble lot. He had an unfailing stock of good nature, and was expert in telling a humorous story, was perfectly at home in the woods, a fair carpenter and a good farmer, and in short was as agreeable a companion as one could find in a day's journey. He would not have been at home in a library, but he was home in the forest. In 1806 he married Nancy Hanks, a young woman from Virginia, who became the mother of the president. Doubtless there are many women among the obscure who are as true and loyal as she was, but whose life is not brought into publicity. Still, without either comparing or contrasting her with others, we may attest our admiration of this one as a woman nobly planned. In the midst of her household cares, which were neither few nor light, she had the courage to undertake to teach her husband to read and write. She also gave her children a start in learning. Of her the President, nearly half a century after her death, said to Seward, with tears, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother. Blessings on her memory." Mr. Lincoln himself never manifested much interest in his genealogy. At one time he did give out a brief statement concerning his ancestors because it seemed to be demanded by the exigencies of the campaign. But at another time, when questioned by Mr. J.L. Scripps, editor of the Chicago Tribune, he answered, "Why, Scripps, is it a great piece of folly to make anything out of me or my early life? It can all be condensed into a single sentence, and that sentence you will find in Gray's Elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor. That is my life, and that is all you or anyone else can make out of it." In all this he was neither proud nor depreciative of his people. He was simply modest, nor did he ever outgrow his sympathy with the common people. Chapter 3. Early Years. The year 1809 was fruitful in the birth of great men in the Anglo-Saxon race. In that year was born Charles Darwin, scientist, Alfred Tennyson, poet, William E. Gladstone, statesman, and not least Abraham Lincoln, liberator. Thomas Lincoln was left fatherless in early boyhood and grew up without any schooling or any definite work. He did odd jobs as they were offered. He called himself a carpenter, but in a day when the outfit of tools numbered only a half a dozen, and when every man was mainly his own carpenter, his trade could not amount to much. Employment was unsteady and pay was small. Thomas Lincoln, after his marriage to Nancy Hanks, lived in Elizabethtown, where the first child, Sarah, was born. Shortly after this event he decided to combine farming with his trade of carpenting, and so removed to a farm 14 miles out, situated in what is now L.A. Rue country, where his wife, on the 20th day of February, 1809, gave birth to a son who was named Abraham after his grandfather. The child was born in a log cabin of a kind very common in that day and for many years later. It was built 4 square and comprised only of 1 room, 1 window, and a door. Here they lived for little more than 4 years, when the father removed to another farm about 14 miles further to the northeast. The occasion of this removal and of the subsequent one, 2 or 3 years later, was undoubtedly the uncertainty of land titles in Kentucky in that day. The roving disposition cannot fairly be charged to shiftlessness. In spite of the extraordinary disadvantages of Thomas Lincoln's early life, he lived as well as his neighbors, though that was humble enough, and accumulated a small amount of property in spite of the low rate of compensation. In the year 1816, Thomas determined to migrate to Indiana. He sold out his farm, receiving for it the equivalent of $300. Of this sum, $20 was in cash and the rest was in whiskey, 10 barrels, which passed as a kind of currency in that day. Then he loaded the bulk of his goods on a flat boat floating down the stream called Rolling Fork into Salt Creek, there into the Ohio River, in fact to the bottom of that river. The watercourse was obstructed with stumps and especially with sawyers, or trees in the river which, forced by the current, make an up and down motion like that of a man sawing wood. The flat boat became entangled in these obstructions and was upset, and the cargo went down to the bottom. By dint of great labor, much of this was rescued, and the travelers pushed on as far as Thompson's Ferry in Perry County, Indiana. There the cargo was left in charge of friends, and Lincoln returned to his family and the rest of his goods. During his father's absence, the boy Abe had his first observation of sorrow. A brother had been born in the cabin and had died in infancy. The little grave was in the wilderness, and before leaving that country forever, the mother, leading her 6-year-old boy by the hand, paid a farewell visit to the grave. The child beheld with awe the silent grief of the mother, and carried in his memory that scene to his dying day. The father returned with glowing accounts of the new home. The family and the fortune, to use so dignified a name for such meager possessions, were loaded into a wagon or a cart, and they were soon on the way to their new home. The traveling was slow, but the weather was fine, the journey prosperous, and they arrived duly at their destination. They pushed northward, or back from the river, about 18 miles into the wood, and settled in Spencer County, near to a hamlet named Gentryville. Here they established their new home. The first thing, of course, was to stake off the land, enter the claim, and pay the government fee at the United States Land Office. The amount of land was 1/4 section, or 160 acres. The next thing was to erect a cabin. In this case, the cabin consisted of what was called a half-faced camp. That is, the structure was entirely open on one of its 4 sides. This was at the lower side of the roof, and the opening was partly concealed by the hanging of the skins of deer and other wild animals. The open face fully supplied all the need of door and window. The structure was built 4 square, 14 feet each way. Posts were set up at the corners, and the sides were made of poles placed as near together as possible. The fireplace and chimney were built at the back and outside. The chief advantage of this style of domicile is that it provides plenty of fresh air, with one side of the room entirely open, and with a huge fireplace at the other side. The sanitary problem of ventilation was solved. There were no Brussels carpets, no Persian rugs, no hardwood floors. The bare soil was pounded hard, and that was the floor. There were 2 beds in the 2 rear corners of the rooms. The corner position saved both space and labor. The 2 sides of the bed were composed of parts of the 2 walls. At the opening angle a stake, with a forked top, was driven into the ground, and from this to the walls were laid 2 poles at right angles. This made the frame of the bed. Then, shakes or large hand-made shingles were placed crosswise. Upon these were laid the ticks filled with feathers or corn husks, and the couch was complete, not stylish, but comfortable. The produce on his farm was chiefly corn, though a little wheat was raised for a change of diet. Doubtless there were enough of the staple vegetables which grow easily in that country. Butcher shops were not needed, owing to the abundance of wild game. The principal portion of the life of the average boy concerns his schooling. As nearly as can be determined, the aggregate of young Lincoln's schooling was about 1 year, and this was divided between 5 teachers, an average of less than 3 months to each, and spread out over many years. The branches taught were readin', writin', and chipperin', to the rule of 3. Any young man who happened along with a fair knowledge of the 3 great R's, readin', writin', arithmetic, was thought fit to set up a school, taking his small pay in cash and boarding around, that is, spending 1 day or more at a time as the guest of each of his patrons. There was nothing of special interest to any of these teachers, but their names are preserved simply because the fact that they did teach him is a matter of great interest. The first teacher was Zachariah Riney, a Roman Catholic, from whose schoolroom the Protestants were excluded or excused during the opening exercises. Then came Caleb Hazel. These were in Kentucky. Therefore, the instruction of Lincoln must have come to an end by the time he was 7 years old. When 10 years old, he studied under one Dorsey, when about 14 under Crawford, and when 16 under Swaney. It can hardly be doubted that his mother's instruction was of more worth than all these put together. A woman who, under such limitations, had energy enough to teach her husband to read and write, was a rare character, and her influence could not be other than invaluable to the bright boy. Charles Lamb classified all the literature in 2 divisions, books that are not books and books that are books. It is important that every boy learn to read, but a far more important question is, what use does he make of his ability to read? Does he read books that are books? Let us now see what use Lincoln made of his knowledge of reading. In those days, books were rare and his library was small and select. It consisted at first of 3 volumes, the Bible, Aesop's Fables, and Pilgrim's Progress. Sometime in the 80s, a prominent magazine published a series of articles written by men of eminence in the various walks of life, under the title of Books That Have Helped Me. The most noticeable fact was that each of these eminent men who had read hundreds of books, specified not more than 3 or 4 books. Lincoln's first list was of 3. They were emphatically books. Day after day he read, pondered, and inwardly digested them until they were his own. Better books he could not have found in all the universities of Europe, and we begin to understand where he got his moral vision, his precision of English style, and his shrewd humor. Later he borrowed from a neighbor, Josiah Crawford, a copy of Weem's Life of Washington. In lieu of a bookcase he tucked this one night into a chinking of the cabin. A rainstorm came up and soaked the book through and through. By morning it presented a sorry appearance. The damage was done and could not be repaired. Crestfallen, the lad carried it back to the owner, and having no money, offered to pay for his mischief in work. Crawford agreed, and named 75 cents in labor as a fair sum. "Does this pay for the book?" the borrower asked, "or only for the damage of the book?" Crawford reckoned that the book wasn't of much account to him or to anyone else, so Lincoln cheerfully did the work. It was for 3 days, and owned the book. Later he had A Life of Henry Clay, whom he nearly idealized. His one poet was Burns, whom he knew by heart from A to Z. Throughout his life he ranked Burns next to Shakespeare. The hymns which he most loved must have had influence not only in his religious spirit, but also on his literary taste. Those which are mentioned are, Am I a Soldier of the Cross? How tedious and tasteless the hours! There is a fountain filled with blood, and, Alas, and did my Saviour bleed? Good hymns, every one of them, in that day or in any day. Having no slate, he did his sums in the sand on the ground, or on a wooden shovel, which after it was covered on both sides he scraped down so as to erase the work. A notebook is preserved, containing, along with examples in arithmetic, the boyish doggerel. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, he will be good, but God knows when. The penmanship bears a striking resemblance to that in later life. About a year after Thomas Lincoln's family settled in Indiana, they were followed by some neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Sparrow of Dennis Hanks. To these surrendered their camp, and built for themselves a cabin, which was slightly more pretentious than the first. It had an attic, and for the stairway there were pegs in the wall up which an active boy could readily climb. There was a stationary table, the legs being driven into the ground, some 3-legged stools, and a Dutch oven. In the year 1818, a mysterious epidemic passed over the region, working havoc with men and cattle. It was called the milk sick. Just what it was, physicians were unable to determine, but it was very destructive. Both Mr. and Mrs. Sparrow were attacked. They were removed, for better care, to the home of the Lincolns, where they shortly died. By this time Mrs. Lincoln was down with the same scourge. There was no doctor to be had, the nearest one being 35 miles away. Probably it made no difference. At all events, she soon died, and the future president passed into his first sorrow. The widowed husband was undertaker. With his own hands he riveted the planks, made the coffin, and buried Nancy Hanks, that remarkable woman. There was no pastor, no funeral service. The grave was marked by a wooden slab, which, long years after, in 1879, was replaced by a stone suitably inscribed. A traveling preacher known as Parson Alkin had occasionally preached in the neighborhood of the Lincolns in Kentucky. The young boy now put to use his knowledge of writing. He wrote a letter to the parson inviting him to come over and preach the funeral sermon. He now contrived to get the letter to its destination we do not know, but it was done. The kind-hearted preacher cheerfully consented, though it involved a long hard journey. He came at his earliest convenience, which was some time the next year. There were no church in which to hold the service. Lincoln never saw a building of any description until he was grown, but the neighbors, to the number of about 200, assembled under the trees, where the parson delivered a memorial sermon. Lincoln was 9 years old when his mother died, on October 5th, 1818. Her lot was hard, her horizon was narrow, her opportunities never restricted. Her life was one of toil and poverty. All through her life and after her untimely death, many people would have said that she had had, at best, but a poor chance in the world. Surely no one would have predicted that her name would come to be known and reverenced from ocean to ocean. But she was faithful, brave, cheerful. She did her duty lovingly. In later years, the nation joined with her son in paying honor to the memory of this noble, overworked, uncomplaining woman.